Next, we'll go to standards and assessment, and the committee chair, Gravitt, you ready to report? Okay. Let me turn your mic on. You're ready, except that mic's not on.
I meant ready, Mark. Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, first item, actionable item is 11.2. This is R277733, which is an amendment to the adult education program. And this amendment just would allow for more appropriate budgeting for LEAs for long-term needs and for obligations. The motion before the board, is the committee moves that the board approve R277733 draft 2 on second and final reading.
Okay, excuse me. The motion before the board is the board approve R277-733 draft 2 on second and final reading. Discussion to the motion. Board Member Belknap.
Sorry, Chair. Jenny, I did have one other question on that. May I address here?
You can try.
And you said it's more appropriate funding. Does that mean that they can either use WPU funding or is also use some of their grant money together, or you don't? I'll ask it later.
Well, why don't we clear that up now? I mean, I think appropriate means they can manage their budget. It's not restricted as much. So, for example, it has that example of an LEA with $1 million allocation. If they have to budget within $50,000, that's pretty restrictive. But I would want help. Please. No, good question, Laura.
Oh, well, I can, whatever, you can use two mics if you'd like.
Brian Olmsted, Coordinator, Student Support. And the financial question is previously there was a $50,000 limit, so you could carry over 10% or $50,000, whichever is less, for some of our for flow-through money. And so for some of our very large programs, that's just a tiny, tiny portion.
Yeah, does that make, okay.
Thank you, Brian. Does that answer your question, Board Member Belknap?
Close enough.
Okay. The motion before the board is that the board approve R277-733 draft 2 on second and final reading. Not seeing any further discussion, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter?
I'm an aye.
Okay, thank you. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Please continue.
Okay, 11.3, R277735 is corrections education programs. This is a repeal because it's no longer necessary. So the motion before the board is the committee moves that the board repeal rule R277735 on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion before the board is that the board repeal rule R277-735 on second and final reading. Not seeing any discussion to the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Oh, Board Member Bolter?
Aye.
Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Please continue.
Okay, item number 11.4, R277702, procedures for the Utah High School Completion Diploma. This is an amendment, and the goal of this was really just to have some minor editing changes, date changes, a URL change, and then just make things consistent. And so the motion before the board was the committee moves that the board approve R277702 draft 1 on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion before the board is that the board approve R277-702 draft 1 on second and final reading. Discussion to the motion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter?
Aye.
Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Thank you.
Okay, item number 11.5, the Utah Perkins via state plan. This one, back in May, we approved a one-year transition plan for federal program year 2019. In committee meeting, we approved the 4-year state plan. So the motion before the board is the committee moves that the board approve the Utah Perkins 5 state plan.
Okay, the motion before the board is that the board approve the Utah Perkins 5 state plan. Discussion to the motion. Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter?
Aye.
Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Thank you.
Okay, 11.6, R2777108, the annual assurance of compliance by local school boards, an amendment. We've had quite a discussion about this, but looking at it more carefully, we decided we need some more time. We need to talk to stakeholders. The superintendents were in a conference and we wanted their input. So with that, we decided to just, the motion for the board, the committee moves that the board approve R2777108 draft 2 on second and final reading.
The motion before the board is that the board approve R277-108 draft 2 on second and final reading. Discussion to the motion?
Okay.
Board Member Lear?
I'm trying to make sense of this. I thought you said you wanted more information, but you want to approve this one in the meantime. Is that it?
Well, part of the problem was, we looked at it, and committee members can step in, but we want to do it right, and there's a lot of work. We would have to go through every single thing, and so we want to spend the next 12 months, or have staff spend the next 12 months really working with stakeholders, update the assurances document so we can make sure it's workable. In the meantime, we need it for this year.
Okay.
And the districts need it. And Jeff, would you add to that? Because you're very knowledgeable.
Okay, please do.
I would disagree with that. Jeff Van Holten, Policy Advisor for the Board. So on this one, we were looking at the assurance document itself, and there's just a lot more that we need to do. But we do, because of the way the timeline works for setting up a rule and making it effective, once it passes the board, we post it, and it still has that 30-day public comment period before we can make it official, and by the time that all happens, we will be needing to get the current list out for this next go-around. So the amendment we're making is just updating the list for this upcoming school year so that they can fill that out, and then we'll take a longer period to make sure we get the new iteration of it done correctly.
Thank you.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen?
Maybe Jeff, you could also comment, there's an assurances audit that we're trying to
good
work in conjunction with, I believe.
Yes, Chair, if I may.
You bet.
So you have an internal audit looking at different compliance components, including the assurance document, as well as we're receiving requests from the legislature to look at all of the mandated legal requirements holistically. So it didn't make sense to take a piece of this without, and while we're pretty much going to do the full thing over the next 12 months and kind of look at our code deeply at every single requirement we have in rule and in statute, and then use that information moving forward on what we want to do. So it just made sense to streamline all of this into one big investigation.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions, I'll repeat the motion. The motion before the board is that the board approve R277-108 draft 2 on second and final reading. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter?
Aye.
Thank you. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Please continue.
Okay, last actionable item is 11.9, the school turnaround statutory changes. With this one, we were trying to decide the criteria for entrance and the criteria for exit. We kind of came to an impasse with the entrance because we only had 4 on the committee, and so we didn't move forward. But we did come up with one motion for the board, and that is the committee moves that the board authorize staff to seek legislation to amend the school turnaround provisions to a school may exit if it exceeds the lowest performing 15% of all schools after 4 years. And that's a change from 3 years.
Okay, the motion before the board is that the board authorize staff to seek legislation to amend the school turnaround provisions to exiting the lowest performing 15% of all schools after 4 years. Discussion to the motion. Board Member Belknap.
Sorry, Chair. 15%, is that what percentage we've been working from already? Or is that
No,
a new percent?
This is new.
And what was it before, 3?
10.
Was
right?
10.
Yeah, and this
So
would take
we're-
a bit of explanation. We had a huge discussion, and so it might help to have
So we're
some
going to invite
context.
some staff up.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
look, they're all ready to go.
That 15% threw me.
All of you.
Yeah.
We-
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
No, I'm glad you need.
Name, rank,
Max Lang, education specialist here in school turnaround. So for turnaround, what is currently the exit status is 2 consecutive years. School turnaround is 3 years designation. It would be the second and third year above the bottom 3% of schools in the rank ordering.
Say that again, Matt.
Okay, does that
So-
answer your question?
No, not, I'm just trying to process that. Let me, if you'll say it one more time, is that okay?
Is that okay, Chair?
Okay, you bet.
Say it.
So state school turnaround is a designation for 3 years. So to exit state school turnaround, a school must perform consecutively above the bottom 3% for the second and third year in turnaround.
Any other questions? Well, we have staff here. Did you have one? Okay. I'll restate the motion. The motion before the board is that the board authorize staff to seek legislation to amend the school turnaround provisions to exiting the lowest performing 15% of all schools after 4 years. Board Member Belknap.
Sorry, Chair. So, Jenny, help me. This is very specific, and yet we're seeking legislation, and so now we've handcuffed our staff to this only.
Right. And I was just reporting the motion.
You're making an amendment?
I can continue on with the amendment because we've had more discussion. I just didn't know if people wanted to discuss this
Oh, you're
motion.
going to have an amendment to this
Well,
motion?
possibly. I mean, I kind of wanted to see where the discussion is. Because here's one of the issues that I think, for me, because I had a really hard time with it. But what we're seeing, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, is we're seeing schools will exit turnaround and then they immediately get put back in. And that's almost as demoralizing as sometimes being put in the first place. And sometimes they need the extended help. Instead of 3 years, they need to continue the 4 years. Like, it just makes more sense. And so for me, I kind of was like, I want them to do well. I want them to have the support. 15% establishes a place where they're not going back, we hope. So that's where I got, but after, discussing and thinking, I'm happy to make amendment, but I wanted to see where the board wanted to discuss first.
Okay, well, this motion came from committee.
Yeah, committee, that's what I meant, excuse me.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Vice Chair Brittany
But again, I
Cummings.
wanted to see.
Does this align with the federal designation? So is the federal designation, they have to do better than 15% of all schools, or is it Title I schools on the federal side?
So what is currently in our SS state plan, which we have flexibility to amend, is the lowest performing 15% of Title I schools, because the identification criteria is specific to Title I schools, so that is coherent to use the same, Title I versus all.
Can
You
I
have a
ask
follow-up?
Yeah. Just from hearing some things, there's some Title I schools in this, is it CSI or CIS? CSI, thank you. You're there, okay. I know, it is. That it feels like a discouraging, unsurmountable goal to be in the, you're going from like the bottom 2-3%, and you have to jump leaps and bounds into that bottom 15%. I'm just curious statistically what you've seen, because the consequences of turnaround are different than the consequences in the federal, they're not different?
No, so what's in our SS state plan references what's in board rule, which does cover both federal and state school improvement programs, which is essentially the process that this board went through a couple of, was it last year, with Midvale and Entheos, where you had the state review panel make a recommendation, and then this board just determined how to move forward.
Just to
let's-
make sure I understand,
yeah, one more.
sorry.
There you go.
So if a school does not come out of turnaround and a school does not come out of CSI status, then the consequences are the same. It triggers the same process moving forward.
Board Member Gravitt.
If there's no discussion, could I make an amendment to the motion?
Well, you can,
Oh,
but
well, thank you, that's why I'm asking. So just based on talking to some board members, talking to you guys, and also knowing that coming up, we're going to be, engaging with the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. We're going to be talking to legislation. It would be nice to talk with other stakeholders and kind of find out, like, for example, and I'm stealing this from Board Member Davis, asking, oh, I
okay,
needed
you're
to make it.
speaking to your motion. I'm trying to get your motion.
I learned that from Carol.
It can be contagious. You better
Just
warn
kidding. I didn't learn it from Carol.
Board Member Haynes there it might be contagious.
Okay, I'm just going to take that all back and I'm going to say the
Okay.
motion.
What-
Okay,
what
the
are you
amended
proposing?
motion. So I'm going to amend the motion and move that we direct staff to seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround and then engage with the board's Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee and other stakeholders to identify the threshold for exit.
I
I-
didn't write it fast enough.
Well, I can send it to you or I can read it again more slowly.
Okay, I may have you do that, so I may have you use the
Which?
restate. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have
Okay.
a second. Is there any discussion to this to the proposed?
I'm going to restate it.
She can restate it.
So direct staff to seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround and engage with the board's Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee and other stakeholders to identify the threshold for exit.
So we've got some questions on here, but
Okay.
if you pass that over, she might. Did you get it all?
Oh,
Oh, you've
okay.
got it. We don't need it.
Of course she
Okay,
has.
and we have a second, and you were speaking to it. Did you want to add to it?
Oh, I was just going to say the idea of, maybe we engage stakeholders and we ask, like, those schools that have been through turnaround, would a fourth year have helped you? Would you have liked that extra support? Would having to aim higher been better for you in the long run? That would be some good information, I think, in determining the exit criteria. And Board Member Davis can speak more to that, but I thought it was an excellent suggestion.
Okay. Board Member Hanson?
Yeah, I'll speak against the amendment for a couple of reasons. First, I think the 4 years was something we discussed, and if the school is doing well after 3 years, we don't have to provide full support for the fourth year. We just are there to help out if they start to stumble. So I don't think that it increases the funding that's required or anything like that dramatically. We're just giving them 4 years that they are in that status. If they need it, we can withdraw support as the time goes on if they're becoming strong. With regard to the 15%, there have been multiple meetings, both in our committee and outside of the committee, when staff has had a chance to look at that. I believe, and I'd like to hear comments about the effect of 15% versus 10%. I think there's been an analysis done on that. But it's my feeling that if the school has not turned around enough to bump up to that kind of level, that there is a real danger that they'll drop back into turnaround status quickly. I think turnaround means we've changed the direction and the school is in better shape. I don't want to pull out the supports when they haven't improved very much and allow them to get back in. I think that's demoralizing to the people in the school. One other comment, I think that we have an obligation to change the perception of what it means to be in turnaround status. That we need to change that to more of a continuous improvement type environment and do what we can to have the schools that are receiving help to welcome that help by them seeing that as value added. I don't know who's competing with me, but
You are.
is that me?
You almost ran over by your own voice there, by your own train of thought.
Wow.
So-
Well, you've heard it twice now, so hopefully it's sunk in.
I heard you really well, and sometimes that's what I hear in my devices when there's other conversations going on.
But I would like to hear from staff, if that's okay, Chair, on the 15%.
Okay,
Lorraine, just mute. That'll help too.
I didn't realize that was me.
I didn't either.
okay, we have a lot of comments on this, on Chair Gravitt's motion. But we have a question for staff to comment on.
Oh, in terms of the modeling of the 10th percentile versus 15th percentile. So yes, we looked at schools that were schools that met the criteria for identification in 2015, and if the exit criteria for those schools would have been 10%, how many of those schools would have exited? And that, for that 10% threshold, it would have been about 60% of those schools. For the 15th percentile exit criteria, it would be just under 50% of those schools would have exited. So that gives you a sense. And then also, if you compare that to cohort 1 of turnaround, where the exit criteria was increase a letter grade, that's somewhat similar. So cohort 1, 19 of 26 schools exited using that letter grade criteria. But then 7 of those schools were immediately re-identified for state turnaround or federal school improvement. So that means 12 hours, so out of 26 that, met criteria and weren't re-identified. So that's just under 50%. So that just gives you some points to compare to.
Madam Chair, address your comment. Okay, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
So this motion is to seek legislation. Is the intent that would be this session or next session?
This session.
This session? Okay.
Board Member Cannon.
Yes, I'm trying to think back to, I think it was November that you came and visited with our committee about this. And it gets rather confusing because we have schools that are in TSI, targeted school interventions, schools that are in CSI, comprehensive school interventions, and schools that are in turnaround. And we're juggling all of these. But as I recall, one of the things that was said in committee was that oftentimes it takes 5 or 6 years for a school to turn itself around. And we were suggesting lengthening the time from 3 years to 4 years. Would it be evidence-based to increase it to a longer term than that?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, Leslie Evans, School Improvement. The research we did present in the committee meeting that was gathered in partnership with the Education Policy Center indicated, along with research from the National Implementation Research Network, that an implementation cycle generally is more in the 5 to 6 year range. However, that was well outside where we're currently functioning, so it seemed like a large ask. Yes, it would be evidence-based, according to our research.
Yes,
One thing to consider in this is that the current legislation, and there isn't a proposal to amend this piece, provides an opportunity for that up to 2-year extension.
Okay. So it would be 4 years with an up to 2-year
I guess if you
extension?
combine those two, then it would get you up to 6 years.
Thank you.
Board Member Davis.
I'd like to speak for the amendment. I agree 100% with Board Member Hanson that I don't know if it's our messaging or whose messaging, but I think the messaging needs to be different for turnaround. And I don't think we're there because we haven't even voted on this, and I'm already getting feedback from folks that they're frustrated about this proposal. So I think that we need to do a different we need to communicate differently, and if this truly is, this is wonderful support that we're giving you, it maybe needs to be messaged that way, but I think included in the stakeholder report, as Chair Gravitt said, I really would love to see as some of the stakeholders, the schools who have been through the turnaround program, because we're talking about a 4% difference right now. So 46% pass through on the current model, and 50% would pass through if we raised it to 15%. I mean, I don't know if the data is quite there yet to warrant those changes, but even if it is on a policy level, and I've heard some really compelling arguments that it could be from both of these folks here, but I think we need some buy-in from our boots on the ground. Because the last thing,
Okay.
it feels, what they have communicated to me is that turnaround feels like, let me give you what will be good for you, with no input from you initially. And now we're saying, let us give you more of what would be good for you without input from them.
Board Member Earl?
I agree with what Cindy's saying, and I'm not sure, but I think we're pretty close to out of time for running bills and numbering bills and that kind of a thing. So is this in addition to a bill that's already out there that we're suggesting, or?
So several months ago, Angie on her list.
So there's a bill file?
Yes, so there's a bill
Okay,
file. It's
okay,
just a
that's why I was
matter of
just like, okay,
plugging
to
in
just
the-
start this would be,
Right.
I'm in agreement here. I think there's more dialogue that needs to take place before we try to change something that, yeah, we need to get more input from that, so.
I usually don't weigh in very often, because if I'm going to weigh on this one, there's a reason why schools end up in turnaround. And there's other stakeholders that we're not even talking about. That's the local board and their ability to react early. All of a sudden they're going in and then they're crashing, then they're staying there, and then it gets to that point of, oops, something bad's gonna happen, and then fantastic things happen. So I'm gonna go back to what happens in Utah. From this whole turnaround experience and having these schools in turnaround, LEAs have become better at trying to make sure they don't hit that spot. And they're investing early. It's not a bailout or anything that we're trying to get the legislature to correct up, and extra funding and a rescue. There's a lot of preventative things starting to happen. So we need to kind of keep those guys in this space. And if even on the local district and the local effort and the situation gets them into it, that's when we get engaged in the whole turnaround process. So as we're talking about these stakeholders and all that, it's not about the victims. It's about everyone that has their fingerprints on how they get into this situation, the people that make choices on it, what money goes where, and make those investments. So hopefully we can kind of keep that in our dialogue. So, and I support this proposed amendment. Board Member Hanson.
Just quickly, two more things. The ultimate stakeholders, I think, here are the kids that are in the schools that are failing. And my philosophy is that we should quickly identify schools that need assistance, and that we should help them in a positive way with the proper messaging so that this becomes more of a continuous improvement effort. That's not necessarily what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about this 15% exit criteria. I would like to hear from staff about the urgency of putting that in place now, because we did break that out from the entire proposal that was there so that it could get put into place this session. So I'd like to hear from staff if that'd be all right.
So we have an amendment, proposed amendment. An amendment before the board is that the board directs staff to seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround and engage with the board's assessment and accountability policy advisory committee and other stakeholders to identify the threshold for exit. That's what's before the board. Again, we're going to have it in here.
That's directly affected.
He wants to do it now.
If we amend, nothing will happen this session.
That's true.
Not-
Okay, so it goes back to if this isn't amended, then we go back to that proposal that we have here. But yeah, we can have staff answer that question, but.
Yeah, is that true?
Yeah, so the way I perceive this motion would be that we will be next week engaging with the board's APAC committee as well as other stakeholder groups to have this conversation around the threshold, around what this should look like. We've had a lot of those conversations already, but there's room for more. So we'll have those conversations, and then based on those recommendations, make a recommendation to the sponsor of this legislation for this session, which is Representative Last, to put whatever comes out of those groups into this proposed legislation. And then that proposed legislation could come back before this board, and you could have conversations about where things landed, and if this board wants to make a recommendation in another direction, you could at that point.
So as that takes place, every Thursday until the session's almost over, we'll be meeting, and this can come back.
Yep.
And we can get that stakeholder feedback. So That's how I viewed it, is that number will come back and we can be in support or not, so. Any other discussion to the emotion, to the motion? Okay, the motion before, we're gonna vote on it. The motion before the board is to have the board, the amendment to the motion is to have the board direct staff to seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround and engage with the board's assessment and accountability policy advisory committee and other stakeholders to identify the threshold for exit. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Are those opposed? No. Have one. Okay, the motion passes. So we just amended. So basically.
That's an amendment, you have to
Now,
vote on this.
now we have to vote on this all over again. Okay. I was trying to keep score here and then my notes didn't follow my brain here. So the motion before the board is the board direct staff to seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround and engage with the board's assessment and accountability policy advisory committee and other stakeholders to identify the threshold for exit. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Board Member Bolter.
Aye.
Those opposed? Vote is unanimous.
That concludes the report. Oh.
Board Member Earl?
I do have a question because on 11.8, which is the social studies standards,
Yep.
it says that the committee recommend the board accept the recommendations of the social studies standards review committee. Is that something we need to actually accept since that's the motion to accept?
11.8,
Look on our board notes, not on the yellow sheet.
It was an action
Oh,
item in committee, but
What's
it's
that?
not on here. It was an action item in committee.
the recommendation is that the committee recommend the board accept. Do we want to do that next month?
did we?
What the committee actually did.
Yeah.
We
We
don't
just,
necessarily always follow the recommendations, so this
Yeah.
should be what the committee actually did. Not information, it looks like, right?
yeah, we got information. We said we accept
But
the
there wasn't a
information.
direction to the board.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we just listened to the recommendations and accepted them. But
So
Yeah,
the,
well,
the
we just-
committee
Yeah, we don't have
accepted
any-
the recommendations. The board, even though, I'm sorry, maybe I'm confused then. It says the recommended action, that the committee recommend the board accept the recommended actions from the social studies standards review. So what am I missing?
Within the,
It says the board accept, am I missing something?
was there a motion to forward this to the board?
in committee, we did make a motion to just recommend the
the
stuff
board?
from the social standards
That the board-
committee. But, I mean, we didn't do anything necessarily. We just heard the recommendations, we listened to them. And, I mean, because the standards review committee has been convened, we talked about that, like,
I don't see it as a board actionable
no,
item.
that's, we
unless I
just kind of
have it.
listened and we kind of said that in committee, but I don't know that it was a board actionable item.
So,
I don't know what the action would be.
so,
So they're gonna go
Brittany,
ahead
what?
though, right?
Yeah, they're
So the
gonna,
Social Studies Committee's gonna go ahead with their.
well, they're gonna start the process, but,
hold that.
So,
It-
yeah.
It's gotta
so
come
my
before the board. You
question-
can't,
Yeah, so if if it's listed as an action item on a
Yeah.
committee, it has to come to the board as an action item. And so if there was action taken in committee, that same action would come for the board to fully, right? If I understand Robert's
the
rules.
committee,
'cause we-
everything that happens in, you can take action in your committee on things that just stay in your committee for more information and that. But
yeah.
Okay. Hey, guys, I wasn't there.
No, there was no revision, there was,
You don't have to revise it, but we accept their recommendation. I thought that was a board.
no. It was.
No, you accept the
It's
recommendation.
really subtle. It's kind of hard to explain. They just talked about the review committee. They convened, they reviewed the existing standards. They crafted some recommendations like patriotism and civic engagement. We listened to those recommendations. We talked about the step they were on, and we said, thank you. We accept those recommendations, carry on, but I don't,
Well, that comes before.
I don't know. I mean, I'm
Okay,
also referring
what
to
we're
what's
gonna
in
do
here.
is, we're gonna postpone this, and then I need
We
to
can
have
postpone it
staff.
till tomorrow.
Well, no, not indefinitely, but we still have time today. So we're gonna have staff look into this and what happened in there and what was the motion,
Yeah.
what was,
Can,
what,
can,
so.
can Robert come up? Can Robert Austin come up?
Oh,
and
sure,
just-
I guess we can
we
put it
just
to
deal
bed
with
now.
that?
I'm not, there's still a lot of confusion on, if somebody makes a,
We did.
yeah. Okay.
I'm Robert Austin, K-12 Social Studies Specialist. I was just in another conversation, so I'm going to need to be brought up to speed.
So the question is really what happened in standards and assessment under 11.8. Was there a motion to
Right.
move something to accept? See, in these committees, you just can't accept anything. You accept as a committee and you forward that exception still to the board.
Right.
And I can tell you what we did. I've got it written down.
Sure.
But
And-
but what, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So the standards review process includes reporting to the Standards and Assessment Committee the recommendations from the Standards Review Committee. And the process is approved by the board. That recommendation of informing the Standards and Review and Assessment Committee about the recommendations from the Standards Review Committee is not an action item, it's a discussion item. And so that was.
That was
that's
a discussion item in the committee?
In the committee, correct.
So was
But
it listed as action?
No, it was listed as action.
It was listed as action. That was an error. And we clarified that at the beginning of that agenda item.
Okay.
Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman, one of the things that we're working towards right now is this is our first attempt at moving through this revised schedule with the 12-step process. So any point of clarification that helps the board in continuing this process is appreciated at this time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I guess I got this today, right? And I'm looking at my civics clerk, and it just says recommended action on there. And so that's what I'm going with. So I would have led to have believed that based on the information I was given
Okay. Very
prior
good
to the
question.
meeting. So,
Sure, absolutely.
So in clarifying that process, again, we're not quite to step one in the review being triggered. So that will help us in moving forward.
Board Member Scott Hansen?
Yes, I think that's the question. So we have this process now on standards, on how to kick off a revision of standards. And the committee has started that process. They've gone in and looked at the standard. They've said it should be revised. It's at the stage where we need to have a revision done. And in the committee, we said, okay, looks like you've met the criteria that we've laid out, so go ahead and start that process. If that's a board action, then we need to bring it here to the board. If not, but that's the question. We have this new process. It's, when does it have to come before the board?
Yes.
Okay, I'm looking at the process, and did you say you're at step 2 in the process?
No, we're down after the Standards Review, scroll on down to Standards Review Committee met, which was step 4.
Yeah.
And then report, so step 5 is what happened in the previous Standards and Review Committee. So step 5 is report the Standards Review Committee comments and recommendations. And on the far right side of that graphic is the notation that it's a discussion item.
Okay, that just clarifies.
What's that?
We approved the process but we didn't approve it in enough detail, I don't think, to answer this question.
Yeah.
Brittany? Vice Chair Cummins?
Sorry if I'm getting
You're
annoying.
fine. No, we're good.
So I guess the question, though, is, did the board approve the review of this social studies standards? Trigger that they would be revised? So that already took place in a former board meeting, and
Yes.
now we're just on step 5. Okay, thank you.
Well, that, a committee meeting.
Board approved the process.
That came to the full board.
Yeah, that came to the full board.
On step
Follow up?
5.
Sorry, I'm hearing separate things from all over. So did the committee make a recommendation to the full board that we review the social studies standards? So it came to the full board back in a previous step that says, yes, we want to review.
The board approved the process for standards, if I got it. The board approved the process for standards review, which includes some indicators that the committee looks at, and they come to the committee and say, yes, it's time to do a review, we recommend a review, or we don't. So that process was approved by the full board. But I don't think the clarity is in the process as far as when we kick off that review, does the full board have to say yes? That's I think, the point that we need to clarify today.
That's why we're having this discussion. Patty?
If you can give us a moment, we can actually speak specifically to when each of these steps were completed, and that might answer the question of if they were or were not, and then who's approved each step along the way.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, here's the crux. The crux of the issue is this. The recommendation is based on the timeline. Standards, yes, it's ready for them to be reviewed. Let's pull a standards review committee together. 5 parents from the Speaker of the House, 5 parents from the President of the Senate, 7 people recommended by this body. Then that committee meets and makes recommendations. And they recommended a revision of the standards, along with recommendations that during that revision, which is step 4, that the writers attend to a range of recommendations. Those recommendations are then given to the Standards and Assessment Committee as a discussion item, but it's essentially, the question here is that it seems like it's a given that if the Standards Review Committee says revise, it's move ahead without the board saying, no, we're not going to. That's the question for the board to consider in terms of the process, because there's no place for this board to say, we just heard from the Standards and Assessment Committee, or the Standards Review Committee that is comprised, they made a recommendation. We don't like that recommendation. We're going to move forward anyway.
And that is further clarified after step 5. It says if Standards Review Committee and the Standards and Assessment Committee agrees that a revision is not warranted, then the process ends here. If there is a cause for a revision, then the following steps would be executed. So that's where it states if there is or is not, and then it would move on to step 6. So that was meant to be the clarification, so if further clarification is needed, then.
Superintendent, I know you wanted to weigh in.
No, well, I don't want to be redundant, but I think the question that Board Member Earl has that's actually now not clear in my mind is, it's almost by default, the way you just described it. Whatever the review committee says is default unless the board says otherwise, and I think you're looking for it. I would be, where's the trigger, where's the go button from the whole board to revise? And so if the default is that the review committee, once they say yes, unless you say no, it moves ahead. I mean, that's how the process is laid out now. So you either have to amend the process to add an additional step that it comes back to this committee to hit the go button to say revise, or if you stick with the current process that you've all voted on, and that is the review committee kind of triggers it. So it takes the full board out of that based on the way the process is now. Correct?
Yeah, I guess that is.
Hang on.
Go
ahead.
Okay, that is somewhat answering the question. It just would, and maybe that was just not a fully understood at least it wasn't to me, because I guess I would have assumed that we wouldn't have moved forward as a board, not as a committee. And I guess it wasn't, technically, it probably didn't need to go to the committee, or it did need to go to the committee. And so our 5 committee members accepted those recommendations and gave them the okay to move forward then. Am I understanding that? But it seems like standards would be that important that, and you're right, I'm understanding what you're saying, that in the process that we currently voted on, the concern is that this is something I feel like the full board would want to weigh in on. And so it looks like we do have a, concern there,
Brittany,
so.
we have, Scott, before we get to it, hang on one sec. Okay, Brittany, will you speak to this while I'm reading over your shoulder?
I can't see those numbers.
Thank you for bringing it up.
So in the backup documentation, the standards review process, it does have a spot where the board does approve the, this process to begin. It's step 2. And if it says sample timeline, but I'm guessing the date on here is something that actually happened, not just a sample of what could have happened. But it does say that we approved this on the August 2019 consent calendar. And did that come from committee, or was that something that was just on the consent calendar as triggered? And so there is a step for the board to approve, and there is a date and a consent calendar, but maybe just some clarification onto, did that take place and under what conditions?
Yes, all of this, we followed all of the steps. I do think that it just gets to the crux here of that question about that the board member Earl has raised. Is just like, when does, and here's really the question. It's like a standards review committee of the 17 people who have come together to make that recommendation. They either recommend a revision or not, and this board has said, we accept that and move forward with that recommendation. And the question is, does this board then need to have an official decision on whether to accept that recommendation or not? It's almost like it's a given.
Let me just, I'm trying to catch up with all of this, what I want, what I should happen, what we think happened. We have a procedure.
Right.
Did we violate the procedure, yes or no? That's what I'm trying to find out here.
No, we followed the procedure to the letter,
And if
which
we
is
don't
probably
like
part
the
of the problem.
procedure, then we bring the procedure back and we change it, and so this is what I'm trying to find out.
Yep.
You bet, Brittany. Answer my question. I'm going to come to you, Scott.
So do we have evidence of the August 2019 consent calendar piece? Because someone else was saying that this was a sample of what a timeline would look like, or
Yeah, this
did
is a sample. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember what month we did bring the consent calendar item to the board, but yes, we followed every step.
This is what I want to
for
do,
this standard,
because
right.
I'm going to ask the superintendent. I think we need to postpone this, and I want to know, before we get through this day, or hopefully before we get the day, did we follow, superintendent, did we follow the procedures?
Yes, we did.
And what evidence do we have of, is there a date or whatever?
We have it all right now.
So that sample timeline,
So I'm sorry, we did have a sample timeline at one point in our meeting.
so,
Mike, he needs a mic.
okay. So, did we follow step 1?
Yep.
Yes. Did we follow step 2?
Yes.
Yes. Correct? Is that what I'm hearing? And it happened in August of 2019? Okay. Step 3?
Yes.
Step 4?
Yes. So we held 2 standards and review committee meetings. It was in November, October, and November of 2019, not September and October, but
Step 5?
yes.
I would argue that we haven't on 5, because there is nothing here that says that, it says staff will summarize the Standards Review Committee comments and recommendations to the Standards and Assessment Committee. It doesn't indicate that they move forward. It doesn't indicate anything. And yeah, we did that, they summarized it, but it doesn't indicate that they vote on that, and now we accept that, and now they say move ahead on it. It just says that they summarize it there. It doesn't even say what the next action is. You can move to 6, but then we've begun the process. But I think we're missing something in there. We do.
So after this, after it's summarized,
There's the grade person.
then we go to 6, but they're not relevant, the summary of 6.
They summarize, but it doesn't give that, to accept it or do it,
Okay,
or.
Brittany?
A while ago, I don't believe, so the original, what was it, 12 steps that we had before didn't have this revisit back into committee. So this was an additional step that was added a couple of years ago or a year ago or so. And so if you see in the gray portion, it talks about how, yes, we're going to come and report to committee. And then if committee has any concerns, they can make a recommendation to stop. And then that recommendation would go to the board to stop the process that was started. But because it's just moving forward, they added just this report back to committee, so it's in a public setting, but it's not necessarily a decision point for the full board unless the committee recommends that there were no revisions, nothing needs to happen, the process can stop here.
Okay, Board Member Scott Nielsen?
No, I guess I just had some questions because I know that we move forward on this, but I've kind of been in the dark on this. I thought that that the committee didn't move things, that nobody did anything until it came before the full board. And so that's why I sent that email out today with recommendations, because I didn't know how far we were on this until I saw this already, because I didn't know that we had already gotten this committee together to move forward, and so that's why I think that there needs some revision in the way we do this, because
Well, we can.
I just was confused on the
If we
process.
propose a change or whatever, then we start a whole different but this, I'm trying to be in the compliance space right now, and it seems like we're in compliance. So if we want to change something, then we come back and change the process. It's our process. Board Member Gravitt?
Just to clarify to you, Scott, we did, as a full board in August, approve that we were moving forward with the social studies standards. So we did follow, the review was triggered. In August, the full board voted to move forward. So we did know this, and then that's when things were convened, and that's when we had the standards review committee got together. So I think it's just hard because things get lost in the process, but we as a board already knew this, and this part was we're just doing an extra step, which then feels like we need to keep coming back and forth. But no, we've actually added an extra step in there. So we did approve this. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. We're going to add any more, this is not the environment to improve this, we're in process. If we're going to change the process, then we have to start something different, but. Yes,
I'm
Patty.
wondering if, in moving forward, so this has nothing to do with the process, but it does with the evidence. So what we can do is, instead of uploading the sample timeline, then we could actually put the steps and when they occurred and just put timeline so that we have it moving forward. And that wouldn't require anything. We would just be able to have it up there as the lines of evidence. So moving forward, we know where we're at and when the other things occurred.
And at what step? Okay. Board Member Jenny Earl.
Yeah, so then I do have a couple questions. So we've accepted, but their recommendations, but that really doesn't mean anything in some ways, because so what are we doing? I guess my question is, are we using national standards? Are we going to be using the national standards to, that wasn't a recommendation on the list, but from previous things, from health and other areas, and you could go, anyways, we could go back as far as Common Core, where we've just taken on national standards. Is that the intent? I don't know what the intent is. Just because we accepted their recommendations, what is and maybe this is the discussion I'm wanting to have, is where are we going? Because as a board member, I'm going to have to answer to that with my constituents. So I'm just wondering where we're at.
Step. Well, you want to answer the question, but we're on step.
Would you like for us to answer? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the short answer for social studies is there are no national standards for social studies. There are no national standards for social studies content. We will, and we made this very clear to the Standards Review Committee. This is a Utah standards process. It's Utah focused. We have a commitment to, basically, many of the people on the Standards Review Committee said they really liked a lot of what was already in the elementary social studies standards, that we're looking at pushing the kind of cognitive rigor that's expected, but that they much of the content about Utah history and U.S. history and world civilizations, and the specific recommendations that are in those standards from the Standards Review Committee were very solid in terms of wanting to infuse professional, personal financial literacy throughout K-6 and to beef up some of the cognitive rigor in the K-2 standards, because they're two separate documents. But it's what we explained to the Standards Review Committee parents there is that this process is a Utah process. It's a public process. It will be with multiple entry points for feedback and create the best possible standards for kids.
Well, then I would like to make a motion, if I can. Is that possible?
A motion to, well, you can.
Can I make a motion?
Regarding what?
Make a motion that the board consider this item.
Yeah,
Not-
that's what it
that's
would
not the
be,
motion I-
not, yeah, to consider something, but you can, yes, you can make that, yes, you can make that motion.
I would like to make a motion that we do not use the National Curriculum Standards for Social Studies.
That's not a, that's
That's
not
not
on
a
our
motion?
agenda, so you can't make that motion. You can make a motion to have the board bring something back or do something that puts that topic on an agenda item for, as an actionable item. You can make the motion to bring this topic back.
Okay, then I would like to make a motion to bring this topic back.
And
the
speak
hard thing is now we're
specifically to
2 months
something
into
if you
the-
wanted. You
Yeah.
could make it very specific, so it's not general.
Well, I'm
So what-
making it specific then, that we bring this, okay, so I'm bringing this
wanna
back
help.
to another meeting
To bring
down
this- to bring
next
this
month.
topic back and speak specifically to what you just said.
Okay, I make a motion that in the March board meeting, that we have a dialogue about what will be used. This is kind of hindsight here, 2 months after it's going. If there's any recommendations for what is or isn't used for the standards. I know that was pretty messy.
How about if we simplify it to bring this issue back, to have the discussion of
National standards.
of
Yep.
national standards?
That would be great.
Okay. Is there a second? Okay, we have the motion before the board is to have this have this item brought back and to include the discussion of national standards. Not seeing discussion to the motion. All those in favor say aye. Hold it, hang on. Hey, you gotta be at the commander's desk.
Back in the freeze pit for a minute. I'm sorry, Chair.
Board Member Bill Knapp.
I'd like to amend that motion that it go back to leadership to decide where this discussion happens.
Can I? Okay, when you make a motion to have it come back to the board, it's implied it will either land in a
Thank
board
you.
meeting or in a committee meeting. It's gonna land someplace and people are gonna be prepared to have a discussion to speak, and it will make this, it needs to come back.
Thank you.
Okay, Board Member Davis. Did you have something on this particular issue?
If it comes back, that we've heard there are national standards, there are national standards. If there are, we need to see what they are. So if it's like the Boston Tea Party's in there, we're not voting to not teach about the Boston Tea Party in U.S. history. I mean, we just need to see what we're talking about.
The motion will bring up, it'll create an opportunity for a discussion. That's it. I mean, it's. Board Member Scott Nielsen, speaking to the motion?
Yes, speaking to the motion, I think this is one of those things that's very near and dear to me, but we're not on a strict timeline here. I really, really feel like this is something we absolutely must get right. And I still have questions and concerns about it, not just about the procedure, but about the materials inside of these standards. And so I speak in favor of the motion.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins?
I'm going to speak against the motion because I feel like we as a board would be putting the cart in front of the horse, ahead of the horse, because the writing committee is the one that looks for the information. We would basically be limiting the writing committee's ability to look for and find content or to look at the content that they're trying to use. And so I guess because that's what comes next is they articulate their recommendation in the form of their recommended standards, and then we have the opportunity to look, to compare. And so I guess my concern is that are we going to create boundaries on the writing committee that are unnecessary when we have the final say at the end? And so if we're gonna, anyways, so I'm gonna vote no on this one.
Okay. So let me just throw something to the board, Vice Chair Cummins, for your consideration. Two or more board members want an item put on an agenda, this is to discuss something, then the request happens and it's gonna land someplace. You have a first and a second. And so it's, and how and what, the way the conversation goes, in my opinion, isn't gonna do anything with this committee yet, or what's in alignment, because that's a whole separate subject of how and what we do. It's for some awareness and a little bit of debate, but I don't think it's gonna hinder or change this process unless we choose to do something different and as a different line item. Okay, the motion before the board is to have this brought back and to speak to national standards. All in favor say aye. Those opposed? No. For the ayes, raise your hand. Board Member Scott Nielsen, Board Member Earl, Board Member Davis, Board Member Belknap. What's that? Board Member Bolter?
I'm an aye.
I'm an aye also, but that's, motion doesn't carry. For the nays, yeah, the nays were Board Member Cannon, Board Member Newell, Board Member Mike Haynes, Board Member Lear, Board Member Gravitt, Board Member Scott Hansen, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins. Okay, this concludes our committee reports.
Wow, Jenny, you did a long one.